So, for a bit of context, this was around the time when a friend of mine, Isaac, was living in New York City. Isaac was around 19 at the time and he was at college, so he was pretty much an introvert at times. He barely talked to anybody and he was pretty much that one guy who would sit alone pretty much at lunchtime. However, since this happened in college, he was living in New York City, and of course, he was living with his mom at the time, along with his older brother. They lived in a pretty decent apartment. I mean, it's small enough, but for three people, but at least Isaac and his older brother got to share a bedroom, while his mom got the other bedroom. Why his dad isn't there is another story, but Isaac had decided to take a bus to and from work. He did take the subway a few times, but they did own a car, but Isaac thought it was just easier to get to college than that for the bus, mainly since he knew the bus route pretty well. One of these times, though, Isaac was asked to stay a little bit later after college to work on some projects. So he went to his friend's dorm to basically help him with some projects that needed to be done and due the next day. However, as Isaac was working on that, he realized that it was time for him to head back home since the bus transit stops at a certain time. His friend basically said okay, and that's when Isaac ended up saying goodbye to his friend and left the college. He was sitting on the bench on this little boardwalk, and of course it wasn't really nighttime, but it started to get pretty dark. As Isaac was just sitting there, basically contemplating on what to do, he saw that there was this other guy. He looked about maybe 6 foot tall, and he looked like he might have been maybe in his mid 40s, early 50s probably. He sat down beside Isaac and asked if he was waiting for the train. Obviously, Isaac didn't say anything, but of course, for a moment he said, "Yeah, just waiting for a bus," he said. The guy then started to make some small talk, and he seemed to be okay at first, and Isaac didn't think much of it. However, something really odd happened when Isaac got on the bus. The guy started talking to him, asking him personal questions like where you're from and etc. This obviously was starting to make Isaac uncomfortable, since he didn't know who this guy was or why he was there, or why he was just talking to him. Isaac decided to make it look like he was on the phone, just basically to get the guy the hint that he didn't want anything to do with him. As soon as his home arrives, Isaac ended up exiting out of the train, and he ended up walking the long way home by passing through some places. Obviously, he looked back a few times to make sure that he wasn't followed, to which thankfully, no one followed him. When he got home from his college, he basically told his mom about what happened. So, of course, that's when his mom decided that for now on he could drive himself. But however, though, that the story does not end there. It was the next day after college, and when Isaac was about to get in the car, he ended up realizing that there was something wrong with the van. At first, he thought that maybe it had broken down, but that wasn't the case. He looked behind and saw that the man from the other day was sitting there in this van. He ended up grabbing being his stuff, ended up leaving the van, and ended up calling 911 at the college. College security police as well arrested the man, and of course, he was taken to the prison. But of course, he never was released. Apparently, not really much information was given to Isaac about who this man was, but apparently he had stalked other people as well, including a couple college students. It wasn't really common to see any stalkers around, but of course, Isaac was a victim of stalking. He had no idea why this man kept following him, but it was later found out that he had found out Isaac's apartment building, and not just that. There were some photos that the guy took inside the apartment building, one of them being the most disturbing thought that Isaac could never get out of his mind. It was a picture of of the apartment number. Not just any, but his own apartment number. Now, this was about maybe in 2019, and this happened to somebody that happened to be an associate of my school, high school. He was pretty much in his early 20s, and this happened to him sometime when he was living with his girlfriend. I'm just going to be honest and just call him a different name besides his real name for privacy reasons. His name was Brock, and he basically did some stuff for the school, such as being members of clubs and stuff. He was even volunteer as student council, and he even got promoted at the time. However, this was years after he graduated, and Brock apparently Lee, Lee was one of the most popular guys that always was there to help if anyone needed a hand. However, one of these times, Brock was living in a not so great neighborhood with his girlfriend. They lived in a pretty decent house, and most of the time, Brock had came home, and eventually there would be one around his neighborhood stalking and lurking around. At first, he just didn't even think of it, so he just minded his own business and didn't even bother to intervene. However, something had happened to him that really spiked anything up, rather than uneasiness. Now, as Brock was coming home from work one day, it was at nighttime when he realized that there was someone standing near the front of his garage. At first, he thought that maybe it could have been somebody who needed help, but he didn't even recognize who it was. Brock ended up asking the man if he needed help, but he just dashes away just as before he gets out of his car. That was really strange. And of course, his girlfriend, who came home afterwards, said that all the doors and stuff were locked before she left. So she had no idea why he was standing around the garage door. The next day, however, he was at the garage door again when Brock came home, but this was kind of odd. Seeing that he had some sort of machete with him, this was getting really weird. It wasn't until the next morning when Brock woke up, he realized his tires were slashed by something. Not his girlfriend's, but his own car was tire slashed. Honestly confused and unsure what to do, he ended up going to the police and filed a report about the man. Of course, the police did all they could and they patrolled the area, but however, though, we waited for a bit. But of course, that was the case because it was just something that really messed things up. It was this guy who pretty much stalked them whenever they go. Like a few days ago, after that, when Brock came out from being out to the bank to do stuff and it took him a half an hour, he ended up seeing that his car had been scratched by what looked like metal. It looked like maybe animal claws that were onto the car door and scratched down. Honestly, it confused him as to who would do that. That's when he made another police report about it, and he realized it's been confirmed that Brock was being stalked. Not only that, but an unknown number called his girlfriend about 14 times while she was at work. And eventually the voicemails were stuff like, "I know you're Brock's girlfriend," to "I will freaking kill you." Along with other profanities in the voicemails, that's when they ended up going to the police. They tried to trace the phone number, but unfortunately they couldn't trace it as it was untraceable. However, though, the police report was filed and the police officer would be patrolling the area for the next little while, just in case if the man ever comes back to the house. Eventually, they would check on them every hour just to make sure everything was okay, unless it was necessary. Now, around sometime in early 2020, before the global pandemic began, Brock and his girlfriend ended up moving to another house at least a couple cities over, as his girlfriend couldn't constant stand the paranoia of being in her house broken into and stuff. Since then, they moved. They never had anything like this again, and they have no idea why this man was stalking them, but any intentions that this stalker had were intentionally not good. For a bit of context, this happened to my next door neighbors about maybe last year, and I'm gonna be honest, this was actually quite weird. Now, what I mean by neighbors, don't mean like right next door, but it happened to somebody in my neighborhood, and it was pretty creepy. There was this woman who happened to be in her late 30s, and she had two kids at the time. She had a really nice husband, and they had two dogs, and they lived in a pretty decent sized house. Their kids were about 8 and 11, so it was pretty a nice house. While she was just pretty much getting everything ready for dinner, she ended up hearing a knock at the door. Curious as she was, she went up to go and answer the door. However, she recognized that someone was out there. It didn't look like anyone she knew, but then at the same time, she realized that it was her ex boyfriend. His name was Ian, and he did try to pretty much console with her by saying, "I'm sorry" and stuff. But when she wanted to move on and wanted nothing to do with Ian, she rudely slams the door. Of course, he ended up getting so mad that he ended up stomping away, acting like he had left. It wasn't until after the kids had went to sleep when the woman, which we'll call her Cassie, was going downstairs to make sure everything was locked when she all of a sudden saw her ex-boyfriend staring at her from the back door. Her eyes were wild as his grin was creepy and smiling. He ended up banging on the door, begging her to let him in, but of course she didn't want to let him in. She ended up screaming threats saying, "Go away, my husband's calling the cops." That's when her husband ended up going to get the cops, and as soon as they did though, the cops arrived, but the man was nowhere to be found, and they didn't even see him. They even looked everywhere on the property, but there was no way that he was there, as he must have been gone as soon as the police were called. And of course, nothing like that has ever happened since, but of course, Cassie still wonders today why he wanted to come back into her life. This honestly really freaked her out even more. But of course, this was once a town. Of course, it was a quiet and small town, but there were so many crimes that she can't even describe why crimes do happen every now and then. But I guess bad things can happen anywhere. It only takes is one person. Now, this happened to what seemed to be someone from my high school. Now, this was a teacher, so he was in his early 50s, and he recently had lost his wife in 2020 due to a sudden heart attack. Since the pandemic started, most of the classes were online, to which it was stressful for him to do, as since his wife had died, he had been working at another job as another source of income to hope and help pay for some of the expenses. Of course, he did get a roommate who happened to be his name was Jax, and he seemed to be quite cool. Jax and him became best friends at the time, and my teacher, who one of the teachers there, happened to be a math teacher at the time. So most of the time, things going on with him and Jax were pretty cool. Nothing really out of the ordinary happened, but everything seemed to be going good. However, something started to get really suspicious with Jax, and the math teacher could just really sense something. When Jax comes home late, he would come up with excuses saying that he was delusional or something. Okay, that was kind of weird, but at first he thought that maybe it was just the fact that Jax had insomnia, but that wasn't the case. As that wasn't the case, he ended up realizing that something really odd was going on. And when something really going on was happening, that's when Jax ended up coming up with weird excuses every time he wasn't around. Eventually, this is when it comes to the attention of the teacher that he needed to figure out why he was doing this. So, the math teacher decided to go and investigate Jax and find out why Jax was doing some things. It wasn't until maybe a week or two later where Jax ended up going mysteriously missing. He mysteriously didn't even come back or anything, and it was really odd. So at first, the math teacher thought that maybe he was on a vacation or something, or maybe it was some family emergency he didn't even know about. But of course, that was until one day when a knock came at the door during the middle of one of his classes. He ended up was confused as to why it was going on, but he ended up looking over to see that there was Jax wearing what seemed to be a mask. As Jax came in through the front door, but he didn't go all the way. He started asking the math teacher about why did he do it. This confused the math teacher as he didn't even know what went wrong or what Jax was talking about. So he said to Jax, "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about." That's when Jax started asking him questions about his wife, and he honestly told him to stop talking about his wife. Of course, that's when Jax got mad and started yelling and screaming profanities at the math teacher. That's when the math teacher said, "I've got a gun, get out of my property before I call the cops." As soon as he said that, Jax ended up dropping what seemed to be a large knife on the ground and backed away slowly before running off into the night. The next day, of course, the math teacher ended up going to the police and made a complaint and even possibly file a restraining order and pressing charges against Jax. Jax had never moved back into that house, and of course, the math teacher got a new girlfriend at the time, and she was pretty chill, but she was at least much better. It was later found out that Jax had been stalking other people in the neighborhood, but the police had said that they couldn't even find him anywhere. Of course, they are not sure if he's been caught or not. The math teacher would like to think that he had been caught, but he just hopes that Jax never comes down to his house again or try anything. This really is a story to say is you need to be careful on who you bring in the house for rent, like if they rent a room or not or something, because you never know what this person could turn out to be.